This is the CNC Router Tips Podcast, episode 57. Okay, how do you wire up a limit switch or a home switch? There's no problem with hooking multiple switches up to one output pin. And in some cases, that's the way you want to do it. In others, you may want to use a pin for each individual switch. This is the CNC Router Tips Podcast, a show which answers one question from you, the listener, about CNC router tables, CNC software, hardware, web hosting, and business. I'll help you get started in your CNC hobby or business and help you cut through the confusion.
Today's episode is sponsored by themakersguide.com. The Maker's Guide. Useful tools for makers.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the CNC Router Tips Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Griggs, and I'm glad to be here today to talk to you about your CNC router tables and how you can use them to create a business or just for a hobby. Things have been going along smoothly here as we get ready to build some things on the CNC router table out in the shop, and I'm getting really excited because there are some projects that I'm working on that will really help to move things along for me and help my listeners and customers to get their CNC projects done faster. I'm working on a few things, and pretty soon I'll be able to tell you all about them. But as a result, I've been spending a lot of time in the workshop lately. Been doing a lot of upgrades to my milling machine so that I could make some new parts for my router table. I'm doing a little bit of maintenance to the router table that I built. I built my own router table from plans, and then totally redid it and made custom parts for everything. So it's really a unique machine. I don't think there are more than 3 that are like it now, and those 3 are folks who built them based off of the machine I built, so it's pretty good. But one of the things that bothered me about my machine build was that I never quite finished it up and made it look polished. There are things like some wire chains that are out of place, and I had planned to install homing and limit switches on the machine and never quite got around to finishing the wiring because once I got the machine running, I got busy cutting things, and I didn't feel like going in and cutting all the leads to my stepper motors so that I could install quick disconnect connectors on them and make things a little more easy to move around in the shop. And so I've decided to go ahead and start doing those things and to make the machine better looking and just make the cable management around the machine a little bit better than it is. And so one of the things that I've decided to do is to go ahead and finish installing the limit switches that I started to do. And it's very appropriate because one of our new members in the Facebook group, the hashtag CNC Router Tips group, Shawn Jones, when he applied for membership, he asked a question of the group that is very relevant to this. And his question was this: when building a slave Y-axis machine, what is the convention for using limit home switches, and are they needed on both rails or on a single rail? Thanks for that question, Shawn. It's a very pertinent one for a lot of people. Now, before we get too far into the answer, let's define a little bit what he's talking about as far as a slave Y-axis machine. One of the conventions that I use when describing CNC router tables is that if you are standing in front of the machine facing the gantry, the actual spindle of the machine, as the machine goes away from you, the long axis is the Y-axis, which goes forward and aft. And from left to right would be the x-axis, and up and down would be the z-axis. So the long axis of the machine going away from us is y. The axis going from left to right that carries the router spindle is x, and the spindle moving up and down is z. Okay, so now we got that established. Many machines have two stepper motors or two servo motors that control the y-axis. They will have a rack and pinion on one side, or a ball screw on one side of that axis, and they will have a matching pair on the other side. And that allows you to move a gantry without interconnecting the bottom plate, across the bottom of the gantry underneath the table. So it allows you to have, easier disassembly and that sort of thing. Some may argue that it's less rigid, but I don't think it really matters in most cases. So you'll have one motor, which is the Y motor in your driver software, and the other motor, which would be the slave axis, or an axis that acts just like the Y motor. So when you send a command to the Y motor to move backwards, you'll send the same command to the A motor. In most cases, people wire it Y and A, or sometimes they'll wire it Y and B. But we'll stick with Y and A for this discussion. It will send signals to that motor, which will cause it to move backwards in conjunction with the Y motor. So both motors turn both sets of screws, or both rack and pinion setups, the same amount of steps to get it to move back and forth. So that's the kind of machine he's describing, which is probably close to the majority of machines that are out there right now. So at the ends of each of these axes will be limit switches, which will tell the machine to stop when it gets to the end by closing a circuit. They're usually micro switches, or they could be proximity switches, or some type of switch that triggers when the carriage gets to the end of the rails. So Shawn's question is whether he should have a limit switch on each of the two rails, on the Y and the A rail. And the first thing he asked was if there's a convention for this, whether you should, it's commonly done one way or another. And the truth of the matter is there are a million different ways that people do this. But the preferred method is to have two switches, one on the Y-axis side and one on the A side. And there's a particular reason for this. When you have two sides of the gantry that can move independently from each other, they do not always stay perfectly in sync. If you run into something, or something happens, a wire gets pulled or whatever, they can get out of alignment with each other, and that is called racking. Okay, and so before you begin cutting, you should do reference the home switches, which will send the machine to the home position, the front of the machine. And so both the Y side of the gantry and the A side will begin to move forward. When one or the other touches the limit switch, the motion stops. Well, if you have two switches there, one on the Y and one on the A side, they might not have both triggered at the same time, because the gantry might be racked and not perfectly aligned with the axes. By having two switches, you can run a routine which will square the gantry to the machine, and what it will do is it will drive the both of the motors forward until a limit switch is reached, and then it'll back off a little bit. Then it'll drive the Y up until it touches the switch, back off just a hair, and then it will move the A up until it touches the switch and then back off a specific distance. And now the gantry is aligned because it used the two independent motors and it used two separate switches to check its position and go to a known distance. And so that's why you would want to have one switch for each side of the gantry. Now, a question he didn't ask but will come up in a lot of people's minds is, what about the other ends of the axes when you get as far away from the front of the machine as possible? Should you have a limit switch back there? And many people do. In fact, most people would want that, so that as the gantry moves further away, there's no danger of it running off the rails. So if you have the ability to put those switches in place and you have enough wire and enough clearance and everything, you can put limit switches on both ends of each rail. Or you can put one limit switch on the end of the Y rail, knowing that the A should stop at the same time, because when either of the axes hits the switch, it completes a circuit and stops the movement. Now, one thing you might want to consider is whether you're going to use a normally opened or a normally closed switch to do this. And the convention there is to use a normally closed switch, because when it is activated, it opens the circuit and lets the software knows that something has occurred. Whereas if you were using a normally open switch and it was triggered, you would know that the circuit was closed. But what if the wires had been cut? Because it's normally open, it would never receive a signal that it was closed, and it would never know. So that's why people tend to use normally closed instead of normally open switches for limit switches. Okay, now that we've got most of that out of the way, you may have noticed, as I was talking about this, that I use the term limit switch sometimes and home switch on other occasions. And you may be wondering, what is the difference between a limit switch and a home switch? And the truth of the matter is, from a physical standpoint, there is absolutely no difference. Both of the switches are switches. They're either proximity sensors, proximity switches, or they're micro switches. Okay? They just complete a circuit, by closing or opening. That's all there is to it. However, their function, actually the way they function is different. It serves a different purpose. A limit switch indicates to the machine the end of travel. Okay, so you have one at the front and one at the back of the machine, and that tells the machine how far it can go. It's reached its limit of travel, and it should go no further, or else something, bad could happen to the machine or to the operator. Okay. A homing switch or a home switch is different in its function. The function of a home switch is to move the axes to a known position from which you can reference all other moves. So, for instance, you can set up a home position anywhere on the table, but you can only set up the limit switches, in one specific way. They're basically at the end of travel, whereas homing switches you can set pretty much anywhere. And to make matters more confusing, A limit switch can be a home switch and a limit switch. You simply share that information about which pin that switch is assigned to in the proper places in your CNC driver software, like Mach 3, for instance. You would assign an input pin, let's say pin 1 is an input pin. This is totally arbitrary, but for this example, let's say that pin 1 is a input switch. You can assign pin 1 to a limit switch for an axis. You can also assign pin 1 as a home switch for that same axis. Okay, and Mach 3 will know what to do with that information. So, you tell it to reference all home position, and it begins to move all the axes until it contacts a switch at a known reference, and then it resets all the digital readouts in the program to 0. And that would be the home position from which you would start your cutting. So the difference between the two is a limit switch tells you how far you can go, and a home switch tells you when the machine has moved to a known position. That's that simple.
Today's episode is sponsored
Some
by
of you may wonder,
The Maker's Guide.
Okay, how do you
creator
wire up
of the
a
Triple Edge
limit
Finder.
switch or a home switch?
Get the edge you need. Save time and frustration on your CNC project and make setup a snap. Save time and material. Set up your workpiece on your CNC router table faster than ever. Accurately set your Z-axis height first time, every time. Automatically locate the corner or edge of a workpiece. Reset your starting point in the middle of a program. Quality crafted right here in the USA on US-made CNC machines. Get the edge you need today. Go to www.themakersguide.com/edge. The Maker's Guide. Useful tools for makers.
Some of you may wonder, okay, how do you wire up a limit switch or a home switch? The simple answer is most of the limit and home switches require 2 wires to be connected. One is a wire to an input pin, which is usually carrying 5 volts or whatever your breakout board is providing, and the other goes to ground in most cases on your breakout board. So I'm not going to go into the details of, wire this up in parallel or in series. Those are choices. If you want to, there's no problem with hooking multiple switches up to one pin, one output pin. And in some cases, that's the way you want to do it. In others, you may want to use a pin for each individual switch. The choice is yours. But I do suggest that you use a shielded wire when you hook these up to reduce chances to have interference, radio interference. So if you're using shielded wire, I believe the convention is to only connect one end of the shield and not both to prevent ground loops. But you may want to check with someone who's more knowledgeable in electronics than I am. I'm just a layman when it comes to it. But there you have it. Where would you get limit switches and wires? Well, there's a variety of places that sell them, and you should have no trouble really finding them. It used to be that you could run down to Radio Shack and pick these up, but there aren't any Radio Shacks around anymore. So now you have to go online in most cases. And a few of the places that I have bought limit switches before, well, first off is Amazon. They have a variety of micro switches and limit switches available. And you can get them prime, shipped out prime in just a short period of time. But if you're looking for a CNC specific store, I'll just name a few that are out there that carry these things. There's automationtechnologiesinc.com, which is a store that specializes, it's an online store that specializes in CNC related items. You can get anything from a limit switch to a full-blown tool changers router table there, and all the components in between. There'll be a link in the show notes to that resource. Another place with a similar name is automationdirect.com. They are more industrialized in their selection, but they have quite a bit of equipment there as well for pretty much any portion of a CNC machine, be it industrial or hobby level. You can find them at automationdirect.com. There'll also be a link to them in the show notes. Another place that you could check out would be CNC for the number 4 PC. So that's CNC4PC.com. And they are another company located down in Florida, I believe, that sells a lot of things like breakout boards and stepper motors and controllers and things there. So between Amazon, Automation Technologies Inc., AutomationDirect.com, and CNC4PC, you should be able to find what you're looking for. And there are many more. Those are just the ones that came to the top of my mind as I was preparing this episode. So that, I hope, answers Shawn's question. I really appreciate you asking the question, Shawn, because it's something that a lot of us have been wondering about and, could use the information. So I hope that answered your question. One last limit switch related thing before we end is a software routine known as soft limits. And what that is essentially your driver software. It will allow you to enter a set of coordinates that indicate to the software that you're approaching the limits of travel. And it will then slow down your machine so that it doesn't, run off the rails again. And it's a pretty nice feature, and a lot of people use that to reduce wear and tear on their limit switches and everything. But I would caution you in the use of the soft limits when you're setting up your original limit switches. I would suggest that you not turn on soft limits until you get your limit switches figured out. You want the machine to be able to home and hit the end of travel on the limit switches while you're setting it up, so that you know that if something goes wrong, the machine is capable of stopping itself. If you have the soft limits enabled when you first set that up, you won't be able to tell what's going on with the machine accurately enough, because the soft limits, the software, is overriding things before the machine can get to where it's supposed to go on the limit switches. So only turn that on after you have successfully installed your limit switches and your home switches and have them operating properly. Then go ahead and turn it on and use that if you like. Personally, I don't like using soft limits, but that's just my personal preference. A lot of guys use it and swear by it. So if you're planning to use soft limits, just make sure that you enable it after you've already got your physical limit switches working. Okay. One more thing. I know I just said one more thing a minute ago, but this one just popped into my mind, and I would be remiss if I didn't let you know about it. A lot of people put 2 limit switches on each of the axes. The Z-axis doesn't really need 2 switches. If you're going to put a limit switch on the Z-axis, it should be at the top of the travel. And the reason I say that is because if you put one on the bottom of the travel, so that it knows it can go no deeper, it's not really going to help you any, because if you change the router bit between programs, the length of the router bit changes, and so the length of travel changes every time you change the router bit. And so that bottom switch will be only a guess in most cases. It would be a high maintenance thing. I mean, you're constantly changing it. You'd have to, adjust it and things like that. And you don't need the aggravation. Just stick one limit switch up on the top of the Z-axis and call it a day. It can serve as both the home and the limit. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. All right, I hope you had a good time listening to just about everything I could think about regarding limit switches, and I hope that will help somebody who's getting their machine together to make it work better and faster for them. If you'd like to hear more episodes like this, let me know. I have to, defer to what it is that the listeners have asked about that, they would like to hear more about. And I really do appreciate your questions. If you would like to leave a question for the show, you can do that by going to CNCRoutertips.com/askme. That's CNCRoutertips.com/askme, ASKME. And you can leave a voice message there, or contact us by email and submit your question. Okay, folks, and one last thing before we go. If you've got an iPhone, take it out of your pocket and open up the podcast app and search for CNC Router Tips Podcast. Okay, when you get to the podcast, next to any of the episodes, there's a little circle with 3 dots in it. And if you press that little circle, it will open up a menu. And there it will say add to library or share episode. If you click the share episode button, it'll give you a chance to share this episode with one of your friends, either through email or through message or on Facebook or whatever. Go ahead and do that. Share this episode. Let someone else who could benefit from this know about it. That would do a lot to help this podcast grow, and it would help your friends to get their work done quicker and find the information that they need. And I'd really appreciate it. Thank you for all you do. I often mention many different types of software during the episodes, and hardware and cutters, and it can get a little confusing. So what I did was I put together a page on my website, CNCRoutertips.com/resources. And on that page, I list all sorts of resources there, from books to tools to software, all the things that I use that make my CNC experience better and easier. And I hope you'll check it out. So again, it's CNCRoutertips.com/resources. Now, if you'd like to have your question featured on the air, here's how. Need help? Ask me about your CNC router question on my podcast, the CNC Router Tips Podcast. I'll be glad to help, or try and get you the help you need. I want this podcast to be a fun and personal experience for everyone, and helpful. So let's keep it real and ask sensible questions. Please use common sense and show courtesy to everyone. That way everybody wins. Here are some guidelines to ensure that your question is qualified to be featured on the show. Please keep your questions under 1 minute in length. If it goes a little over that, that's fine, but don't ramble. If you have a website and URL, you're allowed to share it, but only once during the recording. Spammy or disrespectful or deeply private questions will not be considered for the podcast. If you need to ask more than one question, just make each question a separate voicemail. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. I'm your host, Bill Griggs, and I really hope that you have a great day.